Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Rohan Academy Frontier Dialogue number 11, The Future of Economic Globalization. My name is Xiangjin Wei. I'm a professor at Columbia University. I'm the moderator today. Managing globalization, an extremely timely topic for many reasons. First, trade and financial globalization, together with technological progress, has profoundly changed the national and economic and global economies, including having lifted more than 2 billion people out of poverty. And second, the nature of globalization is evolving as well. Digitalization is changing the economics globalization of globalization. And we will also hear soon a presentation about the rise of a service trade. And third, as some of the economies lack a mechanism or consistent policy framework to share the gains from globalization broadly, many people are feeling that they have been left behind by globalization. And fourth, policies both at the national and international levels will determine the future course of globalization, and how to structure those policies wisely will be some of the topics that we'll be discussing today. We have a set of extremely distinguished speakers, thought leaders today to help us to think about those issues. Today's dialogue is structured in four blocks. We're going to start with a discussion about future of trade, including the role of digital technology, followed by a session on financial globalization, and followed by a third session on policies governing globalization. And then we're going to end with an open discussion. So without further ado, let me start with the first speaker in the first session, Professor Pol Antràs of Harvard University. Paul, please. Richard, you have to unshare your screen. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, Xiangjin. It's a delight to be here. Please let me know if you can see my screen. Yeah, full screen. Okay, excellent. So I'm delighted to be here. Let me start with a brief apology. I mentioned that a couple of minutes ago, but I'm starting teaching today, so I'm going to be around for the first session, but then I'm going to regrettably I'm going to have to step away, and I'll try to come back later. So I'm going to briefly talk about global value chains in the age of turmoil. So let me just give you a roadmap. This is a short presentation. So let me just tell you what I think I can at least try to accomplish in this short amount of time. So I'm going to start by reviewing recent trends in the global economy. And in particular, I'm going to try to answer the following questions, or provide answers to the following questions, which is first, have we entered a phase of deglobalization like some analysts or some commentators have been writing about? And second, if so, is it because global value chains are retrenching? So I'm going to review this, and then I'm going to try to speculate more on the future of globalization and of global value chains in the face of recent geopolitical tensions. And then I'll let Richard take over and give his own view on this potential future for global value chains. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to very basically structure my presentation around 6 points. So it's basically 6 slides. Obviously, there's things that I could expand on maybe later in the discussion, but I thought it'd be important to focus. So the first point that I'm going to make is that although there's been a lot of talk about deglobalization, I'm yet not convinced that if there has to be if there is to be a deglobalization, this is something that's already happening. So why are people talking about deglobalization? Largely, if you've seen this figure that's plotting a very standard measure of trade integration, which is the ratio of world trade over world GDP, you see that since the great financial crisis, this is a series that seems to be on the decline. It seems to, you can sort of try to spot a declining trend in that series. Obviously, it's very early, so it's hard to tell, you wouldn't get much statistical power if you try to kind of fit something negatively sloped here. But in any case, it's been demonstrated that to a large extent, the reason why we see that is because of China. And not because of China de-globalizing or because of the recent trade conflicts with the US. This is something that very much precedes that trade war. Simply, it's driven by the fact that China has been moving up the value chain. It's been doing more and more of the stages upstream from assembly. And that naturally, if you take a measure of globalization, this ratio of world trade over world GDP, that's actually going to put downward pressure on that series. So if you use this measure to claim there's deglobalization, I don't think that's sort of tenable, because it seems to be driven by the success of China in sort of gaining comparative advantage in relatively more upstream stages of production. Now, building on this point one, what I would argue is that if one wants to kind of think about the future of globalization in light of this figure that I'm showing you here on the left panel, it may be more productive to think about the prior period, because this is really what's extraordinary here. You have a series, which is the world trade over world GDP, which in any sort of well-posed model, this would be a series that you'd expect to be stationary, that you'd expect it might grow and go down, up and down, but in the long run, it should basically be fairly stable. And instead, what you've seen, what we saw in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s was the remarkable growth of globalization. So I think it's more productive to first go back to what happened there, and I'm going to do that very quickly, and then try to see whether the forces that drove that period, whether these are forces that can, that maybe have been stalling, and that might why we see a slowalization rather than deglobalization, and more importantly, whether these forces might actually start working in reverse. So the same way that they led to a process of hyper-globalization, they might actually lead to a true process of deglobalization. So to think about that, let's just sort of break up the drivers of that hyper-globalization period into three main building blocks. One is technology. And here I have in mind basically the ICT revolution, which basically allowed, as Richard has written extensively, allowed for a fragmentation of production across borders and better communication at very long distances. This was coupled with policy improvements, trade liberalization through multilateral rounds at the WTO, but more importantly, through regional trade agreements. If you think about NAFTA, Mercosur, the expansion of the European Union, ASEAN FTA, all this is happening in the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. So that basically, the same time that people could communicate better at long distances, the flow of goods became cheaper as well. And third is simply politics, which is at the same time that this technology and policies were increasing the demand for foreign labor from the point of view of firms in the West, there's a massive labor supply shock. China enters the capitalist system, Eastern Europe enters the capitalist system. So the combination of these forces basically led to a very remarkable disintegration of production processes, which has been documented in a variety of ways, but that in the last slide I showed you as an increase in that measure of globalization. So the key question is, okay, we have technology, we have policy, politics. Why has globalization stopped growing? Why around 2007, 2008? And more importantly, could these forces actually go in reverse? So let's start with technology. And on the technology front, I'm actually, I'm eager to hear what Richard has to say, but I'm actually pretty optimistic. In my view, technology, technological developments in the next decade or two are going to continue to foster trade. First, why do I base that on? I base that on a combination of conceptual aspects and empirics. Conceptually, over history, there's very few forms of technical progress that have actually been negatively impact globalization, and certainly the ICT revolution was a big boost to the growth of globalization. Why are some people more pessimistic? Well, they talk about new technologies being different. You got automation, industrial robots, 3D printing. Those are things that seem to be very close substitutes for foreign labor. So you'd say, well, if low wages were the big fuel to fragmentation, if we now can do this thing with robots, I mean, what's the point of fragmenting anymore? Then there's other technologies that are rising and being more and more important. Obviously, digital platforms, digital technologies more broadly, blockchain, this open distributed ledgers that appear to reduce the transaction cost of conducting business internationally. I think there's less debate here. I think everybody agrees that these two are likely to be positive for trade, but there's a lot of debate about automation. My own view, again, based on conceptual aspects, but also based on evidence, is that automation is actually not likely to be deglobalizing, at least in the next couple of decades. And the reason for that is basically the following one, which is if you think about what automation is doing at this point in time. Think about automakers, for instance. This is largely assembly. Okay, there's a very limited set of things that robots can do at this point in time. Certainly, robots are going to be replacing, substituting for floor factory workers that were doing that assembly before. But these robots, they're not producing stuff out of thin air. They need inputs, they need materials, so on and so forth. So to the extent that these inputs, these materials continue to be produced worldwide, and to the extent that automation essentially increases productivity at the plant level, which, there's a lot of evidence for that, this is basically a shock that's going to tend to increase the demand for intermediate inputs. And because world trade is to a large extent trade in intermediate inputs, about 2/3 of world trade is in intermediate inputs, I just don't see that that's actually going to, at least as long as robots are doing what they're doing now, and they don't start doing many more things, this is not going to be deglobalizing. This is not just theoretical predictions. Empirical work has documented, on the one hand, folks that have looked at how plants react to automation. They see that they increase their imports. They're not decreasing their imports when they automate, okay? Second, if you look at, more broadly, the technology aspects of production, if you look at big episodes like the trade collapse on 08-09, if you look at the more recent pandemic, there's been a very fast recovery of trade flows. And that has a lot to do with the fact that global value chains are very sticky. Even in the face of changes in relative prices, because setting up those global value chains entail very high fixed costs that were very much sunk in nature, there's this stickiness. So it's going to take much more than what we're seeing now to actually dismantle these global value chains. And that's purely a point based on technology, technological improvements, but also on how the technology of global value chains. The fourth point I want to make is briefly touch on COVID. And I think that's a bit maybe outdated. I think that's what I'm going to say is a bit less controversial now than when I first started making that prediction in late 2020, which is COVID is a remarkably large shock and a very devastating one. But when it comes to the global economy, it created very large distortions early on. But if you look at patterns of world trade, they've recovered very quickly. It's clear that the dust has not settled yet. There's still a lot of talk about supply chain disruptions that's fueled inflation, so on and so forth. But if you look at aggregate measures, we're basically where we were before the pandemic. So this idea that the pandemic is going to generate this new environment where people are going to be reluctant to travel or reluctant to conduct business at long distances, that's frankly something that I don't necessarily buy. I'm not saying that COVID will not leave scars that might come back to matter for the future of globalization, as I'll say in a second, but I don't think it's the pandemic per se. The fifth point is about protectionism. Okay, so technology, I'm not too worried. The pandemic, I'm not too worried. What about policy? And here, obviously, there's more signs of concern. Why? Because we've seen in the last 10 years or so, many signs of increasing protectionism. The WTO is basically dead. I mean, there's not much going on there. Regional trade liberalization has stalled. And it's even worse, it's starting to work in reverse. Brexit is an example of that. The USMCA, the new NAFTA is sort of a lighter version of NAFTA. So we seem to be deliberalizing rather than further liberalizing. And obviously the big elephant in the room is the recent US-China trade tensions. Okay, so there's lots of concerns about protectionism. Again, we could say, well, that sort of indicates that protection is going to be on the rise. You could make that prediction, but you need to understand where it's coming from, right? I mean, it's very easy to say, well, this third point is the fact that we had a president in the US that was idiosyncratic and he just wanted to fight China. Or you could say Brexit it's sort of some weird decision of someone that called a referendum, but there's nothing underlying. I don't buy that. I mean, and it's not just me. There's a lot of growing evidence that suggests that there's some underlying forces that led the US to elect President Trump, that led other politicians to go on anti-globalization platforms. And there's obviously many drivers of that demand for protectionism, but I think a leading one is the growth of inequality. The fact that if you look at this period of hyperglobalization, we witnessed both very fast increases in trade openness, very fast increases in income. There's no doubt that, for instance, the process of trade liberalization lifted millions and millions of individuals out of poverty in countries like China. But at the same time, if you look at just about any measure of income inequality, those measures increased a lot. And not only that, but there's a sense that there was a non-trivial fraction of the population of many countries that actually did not gain much from globalization and actually perceived that they lost. Maybe they lost their job, their real income went down. So that basically led to a growing sense of alienation that fostered the popularity of certain politicians that said, you know, this was all China's fault and we're going to put an end to this. So I think that's very important because if there is to be deglobalization, again, just to kind of recap and sort of start concluding, I don't think it's going to be coming from the technology front. I don't think it's going to be coming from the pandemic, but it might be coming from policy and from politics. And to a large extent, if that's coming from policy and from politics, it will be coming from the fact that their inequality is growing, has grown, and will continue to grow, and governments might not be doing enough to appease the growing alienation that is following from that. So just to recap, and I know it's sort of fast, but I mean, there's a time constraint. The 6 points I try to make is first, globalization, I don't think it's run its course. If anything, there's globalization, but that's what you would expect anyway. Hyper-globalization was not sustainable. Indeed, that's my point too, which is that globalization was really the extraordinary period. Third, technology will continue to foster trade and GVCs, at least in the next 2 to 3 decades. I don't think COVID per se is something that will be deglobalizing, but it might be indirectly, to the extent that it fosters, it sort of aggravates growing inequalities. And there's a lot of evidence that COVID is a very unequalizing shock, to the extent that that continues to foster growing demand for protectionism. I think that's really where the perils for deglobalization phase are. And I'll stop here because I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Paul has made a strong case for continued globalization with some caveat. Next, we will hear from Professor Richard Baldwin, a professor at the Geneva Graduate Institute and former president of CEPR. And Professor Baldwin will tell us the special role of intermediate service trade in the current and the future waves of globalization. Richard, please.
Thank you very much, Chen. And thank you, Paul, for giving the first few slides of my presentation. So I'll be able to skip a few things here. I agree with many of the things you say, but I'm going to put some bémols on little accents on certain things, and a couple I'm not completely aligned with. So what I want to do is, I have way too many slides, so I'm going to have to skip quite a few, but I want to make the argument that we have to distinguish very carefully between goods and services when we talk about deglobalization. And I would say that there's a reasonably good case that there's peak globalization in goods, but definitely not in services. And that's where I get the argument that the future of services, the future of trade or globalization is in services, in particular intermediate services. So let me get to that. So first, I'm going to convince you that the future of trade is not in goods, but that it is in services as a second point. Let me give you a couple of facts. This is you've already seen on Paul's, although this is slightly different. Paul, although it's not marked in his slide, but I think he's taking all world trade, goods and services, over world GDP. But if you separate world trade in goods over GDP, this peak in 2008 is even clearer. Now, there's more or less a plateau up until 93. Then you got this rapid expansion of offshoring, which led to naturally a rising trade to GDP ratio because goods crossed borders several times. And now it's kind of peaked after 2008. However, world trade in services has not peaked, not even close. So if you see from 75 to 93, it went from 6% of world commerce. So this is services over goods and services. And from 93 to 2008, it went up to 12%. And since 2008, it's gone up to another 14%. So there's no evidence at all of deglobalization in services. And in fact, now, if you look at the share, it's actually quite large, although obviously trade in goods still dominates, but services is coming up fast. The next, let me see if I can get the next slide there. Okay. So this kind of shows you the cumulative growth of, and this, by the way, is from a paper I wrote for Sintra just in June. It's now an NBR working paper. So what I did is I put the goods trade, world goods trade to 100 in 1990, and other commercial services, which is basically digitally traded services, to 100 in 1990. And you can see that the services has increased by 11 times, goods only 5 times. So this is in nominal levels, not divided by GDP, but you can see services is soaring and has had none of this kind of impact of protection or whatever it was. So now what I want to do is focus on this goods peak. And Paul made a number of these points. So this peak in 2008 is false because if you take the 4 largest traders, EU, China, Japan, and the US, China peaked before, US and Japan peaked afterwards, and the EU hasn't really peaked. But it's very clear that the trade to GDP share is not rising like it was before. So that's a powerful message. So it's, even if it hasn't peaked, there's something has changed. And Paul was pointing out to the end of this offshoring expansion phase, which I agree with very much, although I would have called this globalization second unbundling. Okay, but China plays a big role in this. And I would argue that China is not unusual. It's actually becoming a normal mega economy. If you look at the left chart there, you'll see China's imports and exports of goods as a percent of GDP peaked in 2006, and now is converging to the level of other mega economies like Japan and the United States. India is doing the same thing. If you look at the right chart, though, you'll see it's a little bit different in that China is engaging in global value chains. On the selling side, it's still rising, but on the buying side, it's going down. So its engagement is becoming asymmetric. And China is the largest single trader in the world. So as a country, so it's really, really important. Okay, now what I want to do is break down this global trade peak that we saw, and Paul showed us, the trade in goods over world GDP, into manufacturers, mining and fuels, and agriculture. And if you do that, what you'll see is 60% of the drop is from mining and fuels, most of it driven by the commodity super cycle. So obviously this is before the most recent peak, the spike we've seen in prices. But a lot of what we're looking at was actually all about mining and fuels, which I don't think is playing into the stories of deglobalization and end of neoliberalism and all that sort of stuff. Now, 40% is manufactured goods, and I want to look at that a little bit. So first of all, 2 points. Globalization's last phase, this offshoring expansion phase, did plateau. In other words, we got the low-hanging fruit out of that, so it stopped expanding. And of course, trade in goods is expanding, just not as fast as GDP. The second is I'd argue that supply chains are unwinding domestically and internationally. And let me show you a couple of facts here. So first of all, if you look at the share of world manufacturing for the G7 and the I6 are the emerging countries who've seen their world share of manufacturing rise by more than 0.5% since 1990. That's China, India, Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, and Brazil. A lot of that's just domestic sales rather than export sales. Now, what you'll see is that the G7 was pretty stable and high until about 1999, and then it fell and then it stabilized. And that's almost exactly matched by the rise of the I6, which has also rose and now kind of stabilized. The rest of the world didn't do much at all. Now, what I want to do is look at supply chains unwinding by looking at the world manufacturing value added as a percent of gross production. And what this is, gross production includes intermediate sales of firms to firms and final sales. So the ratio of value added, which is essentially final goods, over gross production, is an inverse measure of how complicated and long global supply chains are. As you can see, the global supply chains have been becoming longer up, so starting from, this is the TIVA data, it goes from 95 to 2018. You can see that that ratio was falling, therefore global value chains were increasing, and then it increased much more steeply. But since 2013, it's gone the other way. In other words, the share of intermediate trade over total production has fallen, not suggesting it. The only way that can happen is if supply chains get shorter or less complicated. Okay, so I'm going to skip the trade thing on this as well. Now, the argument I want to make quickly is that manufactured goods are becoming non-traded and jobless. And this is a technology thing that Paul didn't track on. It comes from Bloomberg and a bunch, Nick Bloom and a bunch of other guys, Van Reenen, who distinguish between communication technology and information technology. And information technology is essentially agglomerating a whole bunch of tasks into a machine, which therefore lowers the labor cost share. Now, what I'd argue is the only way to get a comparative advantage in manufacturing is to have it based on something that's non-traded. Because if whatever the input is traded, you can't derive a relative cost advantage, which is what comparative advantage is. And basically that means labor. So most of the trade is driven by differences in labor cost of different types of labor, of course, all around the world. But as automation reduces the labor cost share in manufacturing, it will make manufactured goods non-traded. In essence, that's essentially what's going on in China in an accelerated way, where China is trading less with the world because it's making all the stuff locally. And if you can do it like this, you can see this is the cost share. I have a little model in one of the papers I've published, but essentially this A curve tilts and more of the goods are non-traded. So I don't have time to go through that whole thing, but the slides are there so you can look at it. Now what I want to do is focus on services. The argument is that the future of trade is in intermediate services, and this is written up at length in a paper I just did for the ECB in June this year. That should be 2021 too. Okay, so here is what I showed you before. Other commercial services all over, all goods and services. By 2020, that's about 20%. So it's only a fifth, but it's growing very rapidly. So just on the extrapolation, the future of trade is services because goods has stagnated or is falling and services have not. By the way, it's growing 2 or 3 times faster than goods. So the transition is not going to take forever. Now I want to make an argument. First of all, barriers to services are much higher than barriers to goods, often 1,000 times higher. Most barriers to trade in intermediate goods are technologically linked, not policy linked. Trade in final services is incredibly protected. You can look it up with the OECD's Trade Service Restrictiveness Index. But that's something like a lawyer giving advice to a client. But all this service tasks involved in getting that advice are not regulated. Having the contracts proofread, anybody basically can do that because we rely on the lawyer to do the quality control, not regulation. So intermediate trade is not regulated. It's only inhibited by things like the cost of remote work. Third, digitech is lowering the cost to intermediate services at an explosive pace, and COVID accelerated that by making it easy for people to do service jobs remotely and making all the adjustments necessary. Fourth is there's huge demand in rich countries for intermediate trade services, and there's a huge capacity in emerging markets. So therefore, I think intermediate service trade will grow much faster than goods trade for the foreseeable future. Now, what do I mean by intermediate trade services? This is all the service tasks in the service sector, manufacturing sector, and private sector that are not sold directly to customers. For example, bookkeeping, forensics, accountants, and all that. But let me show you a couple of astounding facts. Intermediate, this is again from the TIVA data set, intermediate imports is more important in services than it is in manufacturing. So the share of trade in business services that's intermediates is much higher than it is in manufacturing. The other one is service intermediates are 3 times more important than manufacturing intermediates in the overall economy, because every sector uses intermediate services. This is again from the TIVA database. The service sector uses 32% intermediate inputs, manufacturing 24%. So for the total, it's about 30%. But for manufacturing, it's only really manufactured sector, which is quite small in most rich countries, is only using 25%. So the total economy is only 11%. So there's an enormous demand for intermediate services, and the price differences. I wrote a paper about prices of services in Colombia versus the US. It's often 15 times cheaper in developing countries than in rich countries for bookkeeping, accountants, lawyers, things like that. Just keep in mind that $5 an hour is a middle-class living in most countries. That's $10,000 a year, which is middle class in most countries. So lots of professionals earn less than $5 an hour. Okay, so this is every sector. Now, let me just give them key takeaways. First of all, trade in intermediate services is something we're all going to have to learn about. And there's 2 things to distinguish there. One, we need to separate goods and services very clearly, because going forward, the trends of digital technology, protection, and all that are having very different effects on them. The second is we have to distinguish between intermediate services, which are unprotected and by and large unregulated, and final services, which are heavily regulated. But because of digital technology, the service supply chain has fragmented and allowed trade in the intermediate services when it wasn't before. Second, automation is making manufacturing jobless and thus non-traded. Emerging markets, miracle will continue and spread geographically because it's going to be emerging markets exporting this. Think India, not China. And service-led development will replace industry-led development for many, many countries. So those are some wild conjectures that I wanted to end with simply to spark the discussion. And I'll stop right there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Richard. For discussion, we have Dr. Long Chen, the president of the Luohan Academy. Long, please.
Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, so it's my great pleasure to hear what Pol and Richard share with us. And it gave me the opportunity to think about the issue. And so it gave me I guess I'm going to narrow down the topic a little bit. It's still very wide, but I'm going to talk about the relation between the digital technology and the future of globalization. And so probably provide some input from a practitioner economist point of view. Now, so I think it's beneficial to first start to define what is globalization. And so it provides us a broader perspective. So it's not just about trade, I believe. It's also about the nature, the degree of interaction and cooperation among the people, companies, governments globally, all the stakeholders. And if we look at the past decades, so because of the environment, the WTO, the rules stuff, and I think one important factor is that, as Pol pointed out, is that the speed of globalization has accelerated in the past more than 30-some years, and partly thanks to the technology, information and communication, which deepens the collaboration and the breadth of the market. And so that's the big picture. And so my big picture conclusion would be that I believe from what I reading both presenters' slides and what they talk, the big picture is that the force of the technological progress will continue to facilitate interaction and cooperation and the globalization. This is the big picture. But then I'm going to focus on the 3 points. The first is that I think is if we look at what's happening for the digital technology, e-commerce domestically, we believe that it's going to be something similar will happen globally, but with some difference. And there was, for example, and so it has some special interesting features, becomes more inclusive, And also, but I think the B2B business will continue to be important because of the cultural and language difference. And so that is the comment on global trade. The second comment on the role of technology is that that part I think I'm a bit more on the side of Pol's side. That is, I believe that it's unlikely either digital technology or automation will reduce trade, global trade. The last point is that it's very much echoing what Richard said, is that we believe that the digital technology is changing the traditional boundary of the tradable and non-tradable intermediary component and the rise of the service. So let me first talk about the first point. If you look at what's happened in the domestically, because the globally, if we think about it, it's really a bigger scope of the collaboration. But domestically, what happened is really the digital technology has fundamentally changed the boundary of the trade. As the left panel, as you can see, is the average distance between the buyers and sellers. It's in China, on Taobao.com, is on average is about 1,000 kilometers. So that is obviously fundamentally from the traditional trades. And also, if you look at on the right graph shows that the average distance for most of the goods is still increasing. So that is the first point, is really technology transforming the boundary of the markets. And we believe the same thing is happening globally. But then there's some difference. One important difference, I believe, is that the B2B, so it's not just the customers directly paying, but the business to business still continue to play an important role. So this is as you can see, the numbers of the proportion of the B2B trade among the e-commerce, that includes the domestic and global trade. And that is still a very important component. And even in China, as you can see, the B2B portion is much smaller, thanks to the China has a very, the largest, probably the e-commerce market right now in China. But so that what I'm trying to say here is that we can see that technology will broaden the boundary of the markets. That will happen at the global level, but B2B will continue to be a role, especially in the cross-border because of the different language and culture things. So that is a trend. Technology will promote the global trade, but then B2B will continue to be important. So, and also it becomes much more inclusive. So that is different from driven by the traditional multinational corporations. Now we have many more smaller players that are able to participate, that are supported by the platforms will becomes a much bigger role for the coordination of this. That is different from the traditional drivers by the multinational corporations. And in talking about B2B, as I'm going to give you the Alibaba.com as example, it's probably the largest B2B cross-border the market in the world. And so besides connecting a lot of small business to the globally, what it does is to provide a lot of infrastructure abilities, such as matching the buyers and sellers, and helps them to do the marketing and provide some infrastructures. One example, for example, is let's say the language. So it actually can translate the more than 100 languages instantly among many of the countries. It actually helps to promote, etc. So that is you can see that the platforms are playing a role that makes the global trade much more inclusive. That is something different. Another thing digital technology is changing is not just platforms, also because of the brand. Shein is the Chinese upcoming brand. And actually, it is really trying, as a brand, is trying to shorten the supply chain, is to organize the Chinese supply chain to provide the goods to the customers in the Western world. It seems pretty popular. And as you can see that it's the technology is streamlined the supply chain domestically and globally. So that is the role of this technology is happening on the trade right now. Now, the second point is that I believe it's unlikely that it's either digital technology or the automation is going to reduce the trade. I'm giving you a couple of examples to collaborate, to spur our debate here. So the last panel shows is that actually automation in industrial countries has boosted imports from the developing countries. You can see that the ones rose bigger, actually the ones that are much more automated. The right panel is the relation between the robot dependency and the labor share. There's no negative trend as far as can see. If you look at across countries, it's like the ones that has higher automation is like the future of the less ones. You can see that it's clear there's no negative relation. So I think, and logically, it shouldn't be the case. Actually, logically, it could promote much more intermediary collaboration, as probably suggested by Richard. So, yeah, so this is one example from eBay study. You can see that when the translation machine is happened to the Latin American market, actually it dramatically increased the trade rather than reducing the trade. So my point is that, as Pol suggested, that the technological advance actually promotes a lot of the intermediaries or the new opportunities. Now, the last point then is that the rise of the service and the private intermediary component, as suggested by Richard, and so that is I think it's really important trend. It's not
we cannot hear you, Long.
Service providers. I'm going to give you several examples. So one is the Apple. So in Apple, actually, it's not just the smartphone, but on top of that, actually, can you still hear me? Yeah. So on top of, actually, you can see that about 40% of the downloads of the Apple's app, the Apple stores, actually from the small business and the new apps from outside of the the home countries. So you can see that it's really the combination of the manufacturing goods and a lot of the service becomes much more possible. And more examples like Facebook. Facebook have it's probably the largest social media platform. As you can see, it provides actually the digital service as the infrastructure. But on top of that, there's a lot of the local participation from the laborers, from a lot of the startups, from people, participate. So that's combination. That's why I think it's useful to have a broader definition of what is the globalization anyway. The Meta is another example. Obviously, it's a huge, about 50% of more than 50% of its revenue actually from other countries. That's another way to show that service becomes an increasingly important part of the global of the global trade. And so, but my final point is that so my big picture is that the technology actually, it's in logic, it promotes the trades because it promotes more collaboration. And in many forms, it might not just show up in the trade numbers. It's meant with that, and digital technology is really accelerating that. But in the meantime, it requires new rules of collaboration. So some examples, for example, we need to have the privacy and the data protection rules. And for example, other things like the current requirement, like the environmental issues. So that requires we have the more rules to have the similar standards for the trade. Those are the things that are changing. Also supply chains, because of the geopolitical reasons, it actually also is affecting the globalization. But I think picture-wise, the logic of the globalization is not stopping and the technology is providing such preparators. So let me conclude. I think I would like to emphasize that when we think about the globalization, it's not just think about the trade numbers, the volumes. It's in a broader sense, it's really about the interaction and cooperation among the peoples globally. And I'm talking about 3 points. The first point is that technology is really reshaping it has shattered the traditional so-called gravity model of the global trade, domestic and globally. But I think B2B is still playing a more important role, especially globally. And I think that because of technology, the global trade has become much more inclusive. It's not just big players. That's my first point. The second point, that I don't believe that either digital technology or the automation is likely to reduce the trade. I provide some evidence. And finally, I believe that the digital technology is breaking the traditional boundary between the tradable and non-tradable. It leads to more intermediary components and leads to the rise of the service trade. And finally, we also need to have the new rules that can help propel such the driver of this technology to make the digital dividends to be shared globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Long, for your comments, especially for highlighting the role of digital trade, digitalization. Many points complementing the previous speakers, some providing some qualifications. By Luohan Academy's arrangement, we'll save the open discussion towards the end of the program. So now let's move to session 2 on financial globalization. Is Beatrice here?
Professor Wei, I think she's not here yet.
Okay, that's okay. So let's go to Professor Linda Tesar, Professor of Economics from University of Michigan, co-director of MBER International Finance and Macroeconomics Program. Linda, please.
Okay, so we're shifting gears now to thinking about globalization in the financial sphere. And I guess I took this opportunity to kind of look forward and think about what are the challenges. Of course, we have the continued issues of preserving financial market stability and making sure that our banking systems are resilient. But as I thought about this, it seemed to me that we're going to be doing all of this business as usual kind of work in financial markets in the face of increasing risks. And what do I mean by this? Well, I think we, looking forward, and now I'm talking really big picture, I think we have some sort of global risks that are going to be challenging markets in general and financial markets in particular. Of course, climate change is front of mind. You can't open the paper without confronting some new story about some major way that climate issues are having an economic impact. We also have just been through a pandemic. It seems unlikely that's the last pandemic we are going to confront. And we also have increased political risk. And the thing is, these risks aren't uncorrelated. The risks themselves are somewhat correlated. It appears that climate change itself could be contributing to increased risk of disease transmission. And all of these pressures increase the risk of continued political conflict. So not only are these risks correlated, but they are correlated across countries. They're also really challenging risks in the sense that they're very large tail risks, in the sense that they're hard to forecast. Many of these things are sort of out of sample. We haven't seen these kind of risks before. And they have very large consequences. So that poses a real challenge. There's also substantial policy uncertainty, the magnitude to which climate change is going to have an economic impact, the magnitude to which political conflict is going to have an economic conflict depends on the policies we choose ex ante to prevent these crises. And given that, it's hard to know what these ultimate risks will be. And I think the final thing I would point to on this list, although I'm sure it's not an exhaustive list, is that there are significant spillovers and externalities. So the policy choices in one country are going to have significant implications for other countries. And I think we all know, I'm going to focus a bit on climate change. There's so many facets to this, but just to focus on one thing, this is just showing the percent change in GDP from an increase in global temperatures up to 3 degrees Celsius. And you can see the implications are large, they're long lasting. They're also asymmetric. So one thing that we know is that the largest impact will be on countries near the equator. These are countries that tend to be poorer. And so we see this uneven impact of warming across the globe. course, temperature isn't the only impact of climate change. We anticipate greater severity of natural disasters. It's going to redistribute where rainfall and access to fresh water is around the world. We're already seeing evidence of increased magnitudes of both droughts and floods. This is going to have an impact on agricultural production. It's also going to put real pressure on migration, both within countries and across national borders. So I think, once you pull the lid off of thinking about the impacts of climate change, one can't help but get depressed. The news just, the magnitude of these issues just seems really, 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 really large. And the final thing on this list is that with climate change, there's growing evidence that this is going to lead to greater potential for disease spread, that the potential for diseases to spread from one type of species to another. Recent article in Nature suggests that an increase in cross-species transmission of about 4,000%, even if we keep temperature increases to under 2 degrees Celsius. Now, all of this is pointing to a greater need for global cooperation. We're all in this together to a greater or lesser extent. And I think if the past is prologue, we have some reasons to be thinking that maybe to be concerned. I mean, after all, we just went through this large shock, as Paul pointed out. It had a huge impact on trade, huge impact on economic activity. And now we're dealing with the aftermath. Even as we're still coming out of the COVID pandemic, we've seen an increase in global debt of 26% of world GDP. Countries did a lot of things to help mitigate the impact of COVID, but this has left us with a large overhang of debt worldwide. This is both private and public debt. We see continued disruption of global supply chains. As Paul pointed out, it looks like there is some recovery in that dimension and maybe some optimism there. We also know, of course, we're dealing with inflation in the post-COVID period. I think there were glimmers of cooperation that we saw during the COVID pandemic, greater risk sharing occurring structurally in Europe. We saw vaccine development and distribution. So this was really a global effort, and there were big spillovers there. But we also see increased conflict as well. So this is a talk about financial markets. So what's the connection between all of this and financial markets? Well, I think, financial markets are going to be key to helping do the kind of sustained investment and to leverage resources so that we can undertake the very large investment in infrastructure that's needed, both ideally with extensive private buy-in. Now that's going to require policies that have incentives to tilt public investment toward some of this climate mitigation investment. So that's ex ante. Ex post, as these crises occur, as we see the effects of climate events, we need to manage what to do with defaults, what to do in the event that cities, states, countries can't repay. Firms find themselves in a situation where they've undertaken investments, but nonetheless, given the impact of these climate shocks, they're unable to pay their debts. And so somehow we're going to need mechanisms for identifying climate risk as an exogenous risk, and think about mechanisms for building in clauses into debt contracts, and to think about environments or situations, policies where we allow for debt forgiveness following climate shocks. What this means is that we're also going to need to be measuring these risks. And I think we're still pretty much at the infancy stage of doing this. We need to think about, I know there's been work, Bank of England has been at the forefront of this. I know the IMF and the World Bank are working on this, but I think it's still at the early stages to think about how we both measure exposure to risks and how we induce debtors to disclose their exposure to climate risks. And another piece that affects financial markets is how to manage the very large valuation changes that are likely to occur. This happens both along the transition as we move from being a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy. There are going to be winners and losers along that path. But it's also going to continue in the new equilibrium where we will have large shocks that happen, and there will be large valuation changes coming from that. And so I think these are going to be large shocks that affect and will need to be working through financial markets. So, what are the solutions? Global institutions are already beginning to work on this. I have to say, as I started to have started to do more reading in this area, it's amazing to me how slow I think academic research is on this. We've had some folks have been working on this for a while. Of course, we have the area of natural resources where they're working on very specific problems. But from the perspective of kind of global risk, there's not a lot of work. And I think there are many, many important issues here, thinking through how much of this risk is systemic versus how much of it is idiosyncratic or location specific, thinking through what contracts look like if they involve ex-ante risk sharing versus the ex-post revaluations that are likely to occur, thinking through who the likely winners and losers are. There's a recent paper by Krueger and Smith. I'm sure it's not the last word on this, but really with a global model that really tries to take into account these underlying risks and then work through under different kinds of financial market structures, what are the redistributions that happen in that kind of framework. So that's just one approach, but I think there is room for a lot more work to be done. And I have to say, I was the editor of the IMF Economic Review for a while, and we actually put out a call for papers. We wanted to have sessions on climate risk, and frankly, it was hard to get submissions. So I guess this is partly a call to this group. I think this is really an area that is ripe for work, and I hope that more people become interested in doing it. And finally, the last thing on my list is measuring and pricing these externalities. I think there's just so much work to do in this area. So I will stop there. Hopefully this will be a spur on more conversation.
Thank you very much, Linda, for highlighting the risk of climate change and the role of financial globalization. Let's next go to Professor Maurice Obstfeld of University of California, Berkeley, former economic counselor of the International Monetary Fund and former member of White House Council of Economic Advisors. Maurice, please.
Thanks, Shangjin. I'm in a little bit of a peculiar position because I am actually the discussant, and I did not prepare slides. Since we've only heard one presentation, I will react to that. Fortunately, it's a really excellent presentation and covers a lot of ground that I think is really essential. And I think it comes back to sort of what Paul was saying in his presentation about the political dimension of globalization and deglobalization. It's not simply about domestic politics. It's also about the capacity of countries to cooperate, which of course is intimately related to their domestic politics, and the ability of voters to understand that when countries cooperate, seemingly compromising on purely national goals, this can make everyone better off in the world economy. And all of the areas that Linda touched in are areas where cooperation is sorely needed, and where, in the absence of cooperation, globalization is going to be severely threatened. So let me run through a couple of these and touch on here. I'll touch on the shocks that Linda mentioned. let me start with climate, which is an obvious threat area for global welfare and the global economy. Just as we speak, G20 climate ministers are meeting in Bali, Indonesia, to try to advance joint initiatives on climate. Obviously, a cooperative endeavor to protect the global commons. And here I have to say the prospects are pretty grim, as are the prospects for all G20 cooperation, due to the tensions that have arisen surrounding the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Cooperation is difficult in the best of circumstances, but it becomes impossible when the potential cooperators won't even sit in the room with each other. One big area where cooperation is needed is just in joint ambition to go beyond the Paris agreements and reduce emissions. Whether that can be done by carbon pricing or not depends on each country's politics. But carbon pricing is a necessary but not sufficient condition for solving the global problem. There are other coordination problems. And one problem that Linda touched on is the problem of imperfect capital markets and the financing of climate investments. We'll see what kind of communique comes out of Bali, but recent experience in the G20 does not give grounds for optimism. Similarly, on public health, COVID will not be the last pandemic. In fact, we're having another one now, another zoonotic episode with monkeypox. And as Linda points out, the climate crisis is one of the main drivers of the greater threat of zoonotic pandemics. The G20 last fall set up a joint climate finance task force to work on joint initiatives. The World Bank at the end of June approved a financial intermediary fund for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, a platform aimed at channeling global resources into effective climate action. But here again, we need very deep cooperation between countries. It's urgent. Think about the fact that at the height of the Cold War in the 1970s, smallpox was eradicated as a result of an initiative actually floated by the Soviet Union, but one in which countries cooperated with large-scale and broad vaccination programs to eradicate one of the worst scourges of humanity. Hopefully, we can move in that direction again. But and then this is a theme I'm going to keep coming back to. Geopolitics is getting in the way, even to a greater extent than it did during the Cold War. What we need to do is advance on many fronts. One component is extensive and cooperative zoonotic surveillance, and work on prototype vaccines for viruses that are most likely to jump from animals to humans. And programs here have been suggested by a group from the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation in the New England Journal of Medicine, by the U.S. National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases. But we're really not anywhere in terms of this sort of cooperation. Linda also touched on the global financial safety net, the inadequacy for current and prospective challenges. Here again, the G20 is central. They proposed recently a common framework for debt restructuring, but it's hampered by the absence of any mechanisms to ensure private sector participation in a problem that is going to be becoming more intense in the current environment. And I see Anne Krueger in the audience, so I bring up the proposal she made 2 decades ago for an international bankruptcy court for sovereign debt. The current framework, even supplemented by collective action clauses, is totally inadequate to deal with the challenges ahead. Somehow the G20 should or must move forward on this. In the current context, a more short-term problem relates to the global financial cycle, cycles of asset price appreciation and depreciation, inflating leverage and deflating leverage, and how those affect countries around the world, and particularly emerging markets. To a large extent, the global financial cycle is actually a global dollar cycle. We're now in an upswing of this cycle. And I worry that another coordination failure looms at the moment in the form of central banks actually going too far in raising interest rates and slowing down the world economy. I recently was at the Jackson Hole conference. I heard central bankers rally to the cause of acting decisively and firmly despite risks to slow down inflation. I sympathize with that sentiment, but when I hear some of them say things like inflation in a globalized world depends on global slack, so central banks have to be particularly assertive in raising interest rates. I do worry about the type of coordination failure that Jeff Sachs and others talked about in the context of the 1980s disinflation. Each country that raises interest rates appreciates its currency. It exports depreciation and therefore inflation abroad, leading other central banks to redouble their efforts to raise interest rates. And we can see this dynamic in the sort of opening and closing presentations at Jackson Hole, with Jay Powell, giving his, sort of Gettysburg address on inflation, and then Isabel Schnabel from the ECB, giving a call to action, which would much elevate the inflation objective above the unemployment objective if followed seriously. And even emerging markets, which started raising interest rates proactively already in the middle of 2021, are raising them even more rapidly this year. So we do face a problem. It may have been quantitatively limited in the 1980s, but with globalization, it is certainly, and the proliferation of global value chains, growth of world trade, it's certainly a bigger problem today. The final point I want to make that overhangs all of this is in terms of geopolitics. Globalization, as Linda's presentation makes very clear, requires managing global shocks and global coordination problems. Without that, the scope for globalization will be limited, and managing shocks requires cooperation. We've learned as a result of harsh experience, starting with World War I, that globalization certainly does not itself lead to peace. But peace is probably necessary for globalization. And in the present geopolitical environment, I don't see how globalization is not going to be set back seriously when there is conflict between, the West broadly defined to include Singapore, Korea, Japan, and a more authoritarian bloc centered on China and Russia, and with emerging markets likely to find themselves in the middle, trying to maintain relationships with both of these groups, and with competition going on, much as it did during the Cold War, between different governance models in the world economy. To my mind, the prime factor in the future of globalization, along the trade dimension, along the financial dimension, is going to be the US-China relationship and how that is managed. Unless China and the US can engage in peaceful and constructive competition, the world is not going to be globalized in a stabilized way, and we're going to sacrifice a lot of the gains from trade that we've taken for granted in recent decades. The Ukraine war has heightened these tensions, and at the moment, it's hard to see how this is going to be resolved unless this war somehow is brought to an end. But that's not in the cards in the current circumstances. So I leave it there. The Ukraine situation is not a localized shock. It's something with global implications for the global order, and it's playing out in real time. And the future of globalization hangs in the balance. Okay, I'll stop
Thank
there.
you very much, Maurice. Speaking from climate risk to policy coordination to the risk of too severe global recession to geopolitics. We will now turn to our session 3 on policies involving in managing globalization. I know Professor Beatrice Weder de Mauro has prepared the slides for the previous session. So when she joins, I will welcome her to speak in our last session. Before I go to the first speaker of our policy session, I want to say that we will have an open discussion, and if you want to speak, and do encourage to speak, we have many more talents in our on the Zoom than our speakers. So please send me a private message. So I'll take note of your interest to make a comment or ask a question. So now let me turn to the first speaker of our session 3, Anabel González, who is a Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, previously Minister of Foreign Trade for Costa Rica. Anabel, please.
Thank you very much, Shanjin. And I probably like to start by saying that as has been discussed, this era of overlapping and compounding crisis presents fundamental choices about how to manage globalization. And we hear it almost every day. Has globalization gone too far? Are global value chains too risky? Is it time to scale back trade integration in the name of economic resilience? and its multilateral trade cooperation per se. And these are critically important questions that we've heard previous speakers refer to them. And I think the answers the answers to them will shape the future of trade and trade cooperation for years and decades to come. And this is why it's so important that responses be based on facts and not fiction, and on analysis rather than intuition. And in that spirit, I would use my remarks today to do two things, or to convey two messages. The first one is that the increasingly fashionable idea that retreating from global trade is in order is not really supported by evidence, and that the continued ability to manage globalization through multilateral trade cooperation requires a reshaped WTO. So on the first point, you all recall probably Bob Solo's famous, you can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. And I think it's fair to say that we can see trade decoupling everywhere, but in the data, at least as of yet. So preliminary estimations that we have run at the WTO do not show trade between blocs falling compared to trade within blocs. For the US and for the European Union, trade with China this year has grown faster than with other regions, except for a small hiccup on Q2 in the case of US-China trade, and it is at or close to record levels. Instead of global supply chains being scaled back, what we see is production networks adjusting, particularly within Asia, to take advantage of wage differentials, or because of efforts by firms to diversify production locations and suppliers. And we can see here in the bottom quarter, for instance, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos PDR have seen their participation in global value chains grow in leaps and bounds since 2010. Other indicators point in the same direction. For example, the consulting company Kearney's reshoring index for the US has been negative for 2 years in a row. And a recent survey of about 3,000 global companies revealed that most have shunned reshoring and nearshoring, preferring instead to ramp up inventories or to diversify suppliers, or in some cases to work with fewer suppliers regardless of location. Now, this does not come as a surprise, considering the potentially high cost, the steep technological challenges, and the uncertain benefits for companies of reshoring or nearshoring their supply chains. Indeed, though some reconfiguration of global supply chains may be warranted, if you wish, to restore some kind of balance between efficiency and security, we should be, I think, under no illusion that this would be costless. This is especially true if the largest trading powers decide to move towards full trade decoupling. So some of our WTO economists have recently run simulations for what would happen if the world economy were to break into self-contained blocks. And they found that the long-run level of real global GDP would fall by about 5% due to less specialization and technology spillovers. And that's, as you may recall, well above the 3.5% hit inflicted by the great financial crisis of 2008 to long-run potential output in OECD countries. And that's not counting the losses from reduced scale economies, transition costs for businesses and workers, disorderly resource allocation, not to mention the prospect of new trade barriers within each bloc. So having looked at the cost, what about the other side of the ledger, the purported benefits of decoupling and reshoring? Because it is true that trade, of course, makes economies more dependent on far-flung production networks and more exposed to cascading risks and shocks. On the other hand, global value chain integration also allows economies to diversify suppliers, pool resources, share information and expertise, all of which makes economies more adaptable, more innovative, and better able to withstand crises when they hit. So this paradox was at play during the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that trade and travel ties allowed COVID and its associated economic shocks to spread around the world within weeks in early 2020. But soon after the pandemic first struck and after some disruption, trade and supply chains became a vital lifeline for producing and accessing critical medical supplies. And this was visible in the data. In 2020, even as the value of global trade decreased by 7%, trade in medical products increased by 16%. So the key question is whether the role of trade as a transmitter of shocks outweighs its role as a shock absorber. And the weight of the evidence from several studies, including last year's WTO flagship World Trade Report, suggests that it is the role of trade as a shock absorber that dominates, which basically means that greater participation in trade and global value chains, far from undermining resilience, can be a sensible countrywide strategy to manage risks. And of course, we must not forget that even purely domestic supply chains are vulnerable to shocks. We just saw it with powdered milk in the US, and there are plenty of episodes like this. And I think that the reality is that this will become increasingly clear as the planet keeps heating up and the frequency and severity of localized shocks, such as floods, fires, droughts, and other extreme weather events keeps increasing. So in such a world, the countries who can rely on trade to cushion the blow of extreme weather events and other localized shocks will be better off than those that cannot. So all this to say that a better balance between supply, security, and efficiency does not seem to lie in decoupling, reshoring, or self-sufficiency, but rather in deeper, more diverse, and less concentrated global markets. And this leads me to the second part of my intervention, the role of multilateral trade cooperation and the WTO in managing globalization. So at a time of increased trade tensions and geostrategic competition, the idea that multilateral trade cooperation at the WTO are to be abandoned in favor of regional, geopolitical, or even power-based approaches is becoming increasingly popular. And I think this is a mistake. Turning our backs on multilateral trade cooperation would leave a void that would be quickly filled by protectionist and populist impulses, with everyone worse off. And I would like to suggest that multilateral trade cooperation is really the world's best bet to safeguard and expand growth and development opportunities, to improve resilience, and support and accelerate the digital and low carbon transitions in a way that works for all countries. So let me say a word on each of these three areas where multilateral trade cooperation can make a difference. So the first one is safeguarding and expanding trade opportunities for growth and development for all. We know that, and we heard it from a previous speaker, multilateral trade cooperation at the WTO underpinned decades of trade-enabled growth and development that have lifted over 1 billion people out of extreme poverty, though the pandemic has reversed some of those gains. While at the same time, rising incomes and middle classes in emerging economies open new opportunities for producers from advanced countries, and increased trade integration lowered prices for consumers worldwide. Now, it is true that some people were left behind, which partly explains the disenchantment with globalization. And it is equally true that far too many countries, especially the least developed ones, have yet to connect and benefit from trade and global value chains. But multilateral trade cooperation is uniquely capable of delivering more inclusive trade outcomes. And it is also essential, I think, to ensure that all countries can tap into the new trade opportunities resulting from the ongoing transformation that we're seeing in the way we do business. And here I'm thinking about digital services trade. And we've seen it also from other presenters. The data tells a very clear story. Global exports of digitally delivered services have more than tripled between 2005 and 2019, with a growth rate of 7.3%. They have far outpaced the growth of global exports and that of all services exports. The pandemic, of course, has accelerated the shift online, and digitally delivered services exports grew 14% year on year in 2020 and 2021. And e-commerce sales soared, with estimates suggesting B2C online retail grew by at least 25% globally in 2020, and then again by roughly another 15% in 2021. So digital platforms are changing who participates in international trade, bringing in more women-owned businesses and micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. We also heard about, for instance, what Alibaba is doing in this regard. And all this, despite the fact that costs of trading services are almost twice as high as the cost of trading goods, that legal commitments on services trade are in general very weak, and that there are no global rules on digital trade. So these are all areas where multilateral trade cooperation is uniquely suited to bring about change to help countries tap into this new opportunity. And there's already action happening here at the WTO. There was an extension in our latest 12th ministerial conference of a ban on customs duties on cross-border electronic transmissions, and also a recent plurilateral initiative on services domestic regulation to cut red tape in this area. Now, the second area of opportunity where multilateral trade cooperation can make an important difference is a more level playing field in global trade to address the perception by many that competition in the global economy is not fair, that it is distorted by market barriers and government actions. And I think dealing, of course, with subsidies in agricultural, manufacturing, and services is a key part of this. We know that subsidies can, of course, be important public policy tools, but they have become an important source of tensions, trade tensions among countries, eroding trade benefits, and undermining trust in the rules-based trading system. The WTO has rules in this area, but they've been negotiated 25 years ago, where global value chains and multinational state-owned enterprises were less prominent than they are today. And the imperative of using public funds to support the net zero and digital transitions were not really on the agenda. So greater information and transparency are the starting point to an engaged discussion in this area that should encompass at a minimum all major players. The third and last area I want to highlight is the contribution of multilateral trade cooperation to help solve the climate crisis. We know that trade and trade cooperation can be very powerful tools to accelerate the transition to net zero. For instance, the cost of solar and wind energy has fallen precipitously since 2010 by 85% for solar and 56% for onshore wind. And this has much to do with trade and the emergence of a globally integrated supply chains in renewable energy. Going forward, of course, much more can be done. Again, WTO estimates that lowering tariffs and non-tariff barriers on a set of energy-related environmental goods could boost exports by 5% and reduce global carbon emissions by 0.6% by 2030. Now, just a word, of course, to say that cooperation at the WTO is also essential to avoid potential trade frictions resulting from the rapid proliferation of increasingly ambitious climate measures. Now, to advance this agenda, and I'm about to conclude now, multilateral cooperation must be revitalized and reshaped So it can do in the 21st century what it did in the second half of the 20th century, which is to underpin trade-led growth, development, and prosperity for all. This will not be easy because we have these powerful geopolitical and geostrategic forces pulling at the seams of multilateral trade cooperation, and they're probably not going to go away anytime soon. So the system must adapt to this new reality. Now, in our 12th Ministerial Conference in June, a WTO reform process was launched with the goal of redesigning our dispute settlement system to make it fully functional again, reinvigorating our negotiating approaches by making them more flexible and better equipped to deliver fast and effective outcomes, and about re-energizing transparency and policy dialogue so that policymakers around the world can keep up with the complex and evolving challenges. So in conclusion, the world, in my view, needs effective and nimble multilateral trade cooperation to manage globalization in the 21st century. And early reshaping of trade cooperation will help countries move towards a more efficient, resilient, better, and sustainable global economy. Thank you, Shanjin.
Thank you very much, Anabel, for your presentation, especially for highlighting the important role of multilateral trade cooperation. Let's next go to Professor Anne Krueger of Johns Hopkins University, former first Deputy Managing Director of International Monetary Fund, former member of White House Council of Economic Advisors, former World Bank Chief Economist, among many titles. Anne, please. And you're still on mute.
Thank you very much. I correctly anticipated that by the time we got to me, there would be so much said that I should not have slides, because much of what I would have said on slides has already been said. So I will try to pick up on some of the themes that have already come up, but in connection with them, go a little bit further in several dimensions. I first want to sort of repeat what I think everybody knows, but it's always worth saying, that it's the relationship of trade and growth goes back way before 1980 or 1950 or whatever. It goes way back to the Industrial Revolution. And of course, the development of steam power for ships and things like that. We had 2% of goods traded internationally in 1800. We now have something over 23%, depending on how you count. I didn't say goods and services, I said goods. And I think that is the correct number, although I do want to point out that when exports and imports are counted, there is some double counting in that figure, which sometimes gets ignored, which may be important. Be that as it may, the growth of trade has clearly been the central part of the growth of living standards and the ascent of man from what we were to the current day and age. All the data suggests that as between 1500 years before the Common Era and 1500 years after the Common Era, there was almost no change in living standards in Egypt or in England, and they weren't that different. Only since about 1700 have we seen part of the world diverge from what was a common, relatively stagnant standard of living, including things like life expectancy and so on for everybody. And when we talk about the world, the ascent of man, we talk about things like increased life expectancy, increased educational attainments, better nutrition, etc. All of the things that have been delivered have had as part of them the growth of real GDP, which has been importantly affected by trade. So that when we talk about what's happening in trade, we're talking about what will happen to world growth and all these other indicators as well. That much said, to have trade going, I think everybody would recognize that we have to have some kind of international rule of law, much as we do domestically. You cannot have domestic trade without some kind of a commercial code in the background for the settlement of disputes, for recognition of contracts and enforcement of contracts. The same is true internationally. And what happened after World War II that was so important, among other things, was, of course, the founding of the GATT, now the WTO, which is a successor organization. The WTO, as Anabel has already pointed out, has a very important role to play. Its fundamental principles, which need to be remembered, are that there's going to be non-discrimination among countries, that there will be national treatment within each country of the traders from other countries, and that there will be open trade regimes, meaning that we will not have hidden trade barriers. We will have the rule of law. And that's been vital to the growth of the international economy and international finance and everything else since World War II. Now, we worry about the current setbacks in terms of economic nationalism. We should be worried about them because it's crucial to future growth. But it seems to me it's important to remember that we have always had a battle, I think, between markets and the gains that will be had from increasing integration, which lead to profitable opportunities within markets, which have then been pressures for more globalization and increasing integration, and those who are opposed to its political process, which seems to be scared of it for reasons I'm not fully aware of or I can't understand, which basically say that we need protection, economic nationalism, and so forth. That has always been there. It's always been a resistance. It is nothing new. I call your attention to the Luddites way back when they indeed were destroying the machinery, even for cotton weaving and stuff like that, which now is so taken for granted that nobody would think of doing it. And we've had that along the way. There have always been some losers. And of course, and I'll come back at the end to this, it is important to have social safety nets so that we can make progress and things like that. And one thing that may have gone somewhat wrong is the absence of a sufficient social safety net in terms of what's happening now. It is not an argument for increased protection, which is one of the problems we have at the moment without that. But let me continue. There are threats now, of course. Maury emphasized the Russian-Ukrainian invasion, and that certainly raises a threat. There has always been an issue because everybody recognizes they want to protect, quote, national security, which is said to mean that we will protect national secrets. Many of us have suspected over the years, however, that some of the things that were protected on the grounds of national security weren't really national security issues. I would cite a recent one, which is, of course, President Trump's invocation of national security is a reason why aluminum and steel imports should be protected. Even these aluminum workers of America protested that. It was so ludicrous as to what it was. And the trouble is, how do we set up to get a distinction between things which are, quote, legitimate interests and those which are protectionism disguised in another measure? That is true of national security. It's also true, by the way, of environmental issues. Lots of labor unions have all of a sudden become tree huggers as they decide there's another reason why imports should not be allowed there. And we need to worry that I think the important thing going forward is to recognize the value of trade, to recognize the role of the WTO, and to find ways which we do not sufficiently have now to distinguish between what I will call the legitimate interests of national security and what have you, and the ones that are really disguised protectionism and seized upon by the protectionist interests because it suits their cause. Now, one of the things that's happened has been, of course, that many of the countries have chosen to have bilateral trading arrangements, thinking that they are as good as the multilateral. They may or may not be good. They are certainly not as good as the multilateral. Almost every country that's in a bilateral trading or several country trading arrangement and not multilateral could gain from going multilateral. Someone cited the fact that Brexit was opening up free trade. Whether it is or not depends on what happens. Brexit the UK was in the European Union. As such, it had the European Union's border tariffs. If it really went to free trade now, it would have left a protectionist device for an open trading system. If instead it develops its own tariffs and has free trade agreements, it could go either way, of course. But the idea that bilateral or regional trading arrangements are a substitute for free trade is certainly not true. We lose some gains from that, and I think it's important always to recognize that. But in the interest of time, I have to go on. We need to do things, I think already Anabel covered the pandemic, which I was going to discuss, where there has been evidence that indeed the gains from healthcare products of all kinds and health products have been so great that countries have overcome many of the instinctive initial protectionist measures, which is one of the cases I think where already the markets have shown the competition beats monopolistic government intervention in these things. But there are many more. I mean, we need the new things that Anabel was emphasizing, so I won't go into those. Certainly e-commerce, digitally enabled commerce are important. Certainly services are becoming more important. I would just add to Richard Baldwin's presentation that much of what we call services used to be part of what was manufacturing, in the sense that many things that are now done in services and subcontracted are things that used to be done within individual factories. Large economies of scale have been gained by moving those to independent entities, but that makes it all the more important that we find better regimes for the regulation, or not the regulation, but for the international trade and services with reasonable regulations when we need them, as to standards and things like that. I think also we're going to have to find better regimes for measuring the standards, because they can become another protectionist measure, which people sometimes tend to emphasize. And the standards become more important in more sophisticated equipment. That becomes another important issue for the WTO going forward. So at any event, with all of that said, political scientists have long since recognized that when you have an international organization, if it does not reflect the political power of the major players in it, it will be ineffective. And to a degree, that is the world's trouble right now with the WTO. We have major conflicts in trade between the number one and the number two players in the world in the international trading system. And that is something that no international organization by itself can change, because those two players are each politically too large, and they need somehow to find ways to cooperate. It seems to me that some kind of an arrangement, much like what we had with the Soviet Union in earlier times between the US and the Soviet Union, is what's important. There were issues on which there was cooperation. Nuclear disarmament, for example, was one. There were some others. And some things, as it was pointed out, the smallpox eradication started in Russia. There are many more. There were issues on which it was agreed that there could be cooperation. There were issues that were more or less neutral, and there was back and forth tugging, and there were issues on which there was conflict. Somehow or other, that has not as yet been sorted out between China and the United States, and is terribly important. It's important for trade. It's important for the international economy. It is also important for some of the financial measures that Linda took up, and in particular, I mentioned, which Warren mentioned also, the issue of international sovereign debt, where there is no regime internationally, and it would be highly desirable to have one. In its absence, the Paris Club has been an informal arrangement of a number of the creditor countries when they're dealing with countries that have sovereign debt unsustainability and need some kind of way of restoring sustainability in connection with an IMF program to change some of the policies that led to this overly indebtedness thing in the first place, when there are such. At the moment, there is no such mechanism, and there has been difficulty because China has become a major creditor, which is fine, but then has not as yet agreed to participate in the Paris Club or do something similar to it, which raises an issue between the US and China, which needs to be resolved for international finance as well as other things. Anabel mentioned, but I will mention again, the dispute settlement mechanism within the WTO, because it's horribly important to get that going again. The United States has certainly been a barrier there. Among the issues that could be put on the table would be ways in which China and the US could negotiate something on the dispute settlement mechanism with China, joining the Paris Club or an amended Paris Club, and getting the political reality of what is needed to get the international trading system going in ways in which it would be highly desirable for China, the United States, and for the world to have it going. It's even more important now than it was at the end of World War II. Why? Well, because we have the environmental issues which affect us all, which no one country by itself can very effectively deal with. Carbon border taxes are here to stay, and they will be seized by protectionists everywhere if there is not an international accord of some kind through the WTO. The environment itself will suffer if it is not, and that's something that affects us all. So for all these reasons, I would argue that Chinese-American détente of some kind is hugely important, not only for China and the US, but everybody else, and that it would be important policy to push in that direction on both countries, not just on one. And I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne. Before I turn to our next speaker, let me note that I'm very happy to see Professor Weder de Mauro is able to join us already. I will invite her to speak after Simon Evenett, but then I will invite Professor Michael Spence to reflect on the not just the last session, but perhaps the whole program. Next speaker is Professor Simon Evenett of University of St. Gallen, a prolific influencer on Twitter. Professor Evenett, please.
Thank you very much, Shanjin, for that introduction. I hope you can see my slides. In this presentation, I'm going to make the case that unilateral trade policy is where the action has been in trade policy since the global financial crisis. I will start by putting this in context. If I had set the task of saying what is the dominant trade policy dynamic since the fall of the Berlin Wall, I would have to have accepted that you had major regional initiatives like NAFTA, the creation of the WTO. And in fact, if you go back to the 90s and much of the noughties, a lot of the narrative about the trading system focused on multilateral developments and on regional developments. Sadly, since the Doha round didn't work out, we've seen a lot less action at the multilateral level, but there are some good points to highlight in the agreement on trade facilitation and the recent agreement on fishery subsidies. And of course, if you were really to do a comprehensive job looking at trade policy dynamics at the multilateral level, you would also have to credit the multilateral institutions with shaping the accession of many countries to the world trading system. So this would be an area there. But if you look since the global financial crisis, we don't really have too much to show at the multilateral level. Government's attention shifted in the last decade or so to regional trade deals, a lot of interest in mega regional trade deals, two of which didn't really work out. The TPP was signed and then the United States withdrew. The Trans-Pacific Partnership didn't work. We did, however, get some other regional initiatives through CPP, RCEP, and the African deal. These are all step forwards, but there was a marked slowdown in the number of RTAs, regional trading agreements that were signed, and this comes through very clearly in the WTO data. But one bright spot, or one of the bright spots of in cooperation between small numbers of countries, has been in the digital area. The digital economy partnership agreements at GI, I think, are a very interesting area which is developing and may well become a source of multilateral initiatives later. But if you look back over the last decade or so, you can't really point to reciprocity, that is doing deals, as generating much in terms of market opening. Now, if you read a lot of the literature, the academic literature, the published literature, you wouldn't get this impression at all. Doctoral students studying the WTO are still studying models of why multilateral trade cooperation happens when in fact it hasn't been happening. And so if anything, where the wrong stylized fact is being addressed in a lot of research. And as I said, the regional imperatives have dwindled. So instead, what have we had? Well, we do have some analysis of unilateral measures, but mainly very salient unilateral measures like the US-China trade war. This is clear, and the disruption to supply chains that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic. And these have been where research has tended to focus. What research has tended to overlook are the more hidden, less transparent forms of trade distortion which are out there. I think there are very good reasons why we have tended as a profession to overlook these very important areas. Now, I don't want to suggest that non-tariff barriers are something new. I mean, Richard Baldwin's dad wrote a whole book about this in 1970. So we're all aware that they exist, but what we just don't have is very good data on this. And actually, it's worth reflecting why. The answer is very heavily incentive driven. The first is policymakers have a very strong incentive to use less transparent, harder to identify trade policy instruments. This has been well established in the economics and political science literature, and I'll show you some consequences of that later. Secondly, many governments have failed to disclose their non-tariff policies to the WTO. The WTO Secretariat, to its credit, is on record calling out G20 countries for not reporting much of their subsidies in the past decade or so. And so it's not as if the data is being supplied to the one organization which should be collecting it. Third, if the WTO doesn't get the data given it to them, they could collect it themselves. But here, I mean, if you put yourself in the shoes of a senior WTO official collecting lots of data on your major shareholders, the governments, you can imagine the pressure that's going to be put on you. So there, I think there's a bit of natural self-restraint. And as for academics collecting data, forget it. We like downloading data. We don't like collecting it, right? So you're not going to find much data collected on non-tariff barriers there. Why do you hear less discussion about these matters from amongst policymakers? There are a strong number of very supportive officials who want to see the multilateral trading system exist. They know very well the trade distortions that I'm about to show you later are important, but they don't want to criticize the system for just in case it's seen as encouraging the critics of globalization. And the last and perhaps very cynical reason is, as I'll show you, lots of countries have been engaging in these less transparent trade distortions, and something of a glass house syndrome has emerged, which is the old saying, people who live in glass houses don't throw stones. And once it became apparent that lots of countries were engaging, lots of the big players were engaging in trade distortions, and I'll show you the data in a minute, then I think we ended up not with peer review at the WTO, we ended up with peer protection. And so many countries pulled their punches. So for all of these reasons, I think it's very good reasons why we don't have the data and we don't have much discussion on unilateral trade policy beyond the trade war and the initial response to the pandemic. And so what I have sought to do over the last few years, last 12 years, I should say, is to assemble essentially a machinery and a team which is systematically collecting this information on the traditional salient trade policies like tariffs, quotas, and alike, and then the less salient ones like local content requirements, Buy America requirements, the subsidies that people were talking about earlier, and putting together essentially a very large data set, which is now publicly available and has been used in almost 3,000 studies now. So this data set is what I want to essentially draw upon. But let's start with the more salient public policy responses, because I think some of them are, this will confirm what I think some of you have intuited, and certainly what Anne and Anabel have alluded to. In the area of medical goods, if you go back to the beginning of 2020, you can see in terms of the more salient trade policy interventions, we see a huge number of countries liberalizing trade in imports of these goods. And this is very sensible policy. Why would you want to tax soap when everyone should be washing their hands? This chart on the left shows you the total number of import reforms in effect each week since the beginning of 2020. So we did have a large number of import reforms. We also had very early on in 2020, a surge in the number of export curbs and controls on medical goods. And these did get a huge amount of attention because they disrupted supply chains. And of course, many of us pushed back against these measures, saying that they were preventing trade from helping solve or at least contribute towards the solution to the medical consequences of COVID-19. What is much less appreciated is that over time, we've also seen a steady drum roll and increase in the number of import restrictions on medical goods. And there's actually been a surge of them this year, which has picked up over time. And the number of countries which have imposed import restrictions, as the right-hand chart shows, has increased about a third this year. So there's some bad news as well. But you can see unilateral policy was, I think, very central to the story at the beginning of the pandemic and quite frankly, since the invasion of Ukraine as well. If you turn to food and agri-food, much more of a muted response, unilateral trade policy responses at the beginning of the pandemic. And this was often put down to the fact that we had very good monitoring of these policies, but we still saw a number of trade export curbs put in place. But this pales into insignificance compared to the developments at the beginning of this, or since the beginning of this year, where we have a large number of export curbs which have been put in place and are well documented in the media. And but I should also add, it's very important to say we've had a large number of import reforms too, as many countries have sensibly cut tariffs on as world food prices increase. And so what we have then is quite important unilateral policy responses, which have been the subject of analysis. And what I'm showing you here probably confirms what you may have read or intuited from the newspapers. So definitely, salient trade policy is part of the story, and I wouldn't want to deny it. What I would like to highlight, however, is that since the global financial crisis began, when we started collecting data from November 2008, we have assembled information on over 45,000 policy changes around the world. And what we can do for the policy interventions affecting trading goods is to tag them with the goods that they are traded in at the most granular level possible using global trade statistics, and then add up what's the amount of trade that's covered by trade reforms and by trade restrictions. And you can do this for both transparent policy interventions, but also the non-transparent ones as well. And there's a very interesting pattern which may go some way to help understand the literature which has been written on the post-global financial crisis and trade policy. That literature basically makes the point that transparent trade policy wasn't really a problem. And by and large, our results confirm that. If you look on this slide here, the dotted green and the dotted red lines show the share of global world trade that is covered by trade reforms in green and trade restrictions in red. So these trade restrictions would be tariff increases and the like. And you can see that once the global financial crisis hit, the share of trade covered by new trade restrictions, which is what this chart shows, is very small. Okay, and over time, the green dotted line is always above the red dotted line. So fair enough, we didn't have the 1930s response to the global financial crisis, and I suppose that's good. What that story misses and what the literature misses is that there's a lot of non-transparent policy, which was also introduced after the global financial crisis started, and that non-transparent trade policy, at least the trade distortions associated with them, covered much, much more trade than the trade reforms. And so if you then look at all trade measures which distort or harm trade, that is the solid red line here, you can see in 2009, about 40% of world trade was covered by some type of trade distortion, which wasn't there before the financial crisis hit. Whereas about 5 or 6% of world trade was covered by trade reforms, which had been put in place in 2009, but not earlier. And so you can see this gap increases over time, and the cumulative effect of all the measures which are in force takes you to a situation now where over 80% of world goods trade is covered by some type of trade distortion. By the way, this chart, as measures lapse or are phased out, they do not count towards the subsequent annual total. So this only takes account of policy interventions which are in effect. So what we learned from this is that tracking transparent trade policies only is deeply misleading. This was only possible precisely because we collected this information on non-transparent trade policy. Now, you might be asking, well, what are these non-transparent trade policies? Well, we can extract by classes of trade policy instrument what shares of world trade are associated with different types of non-tariff measure. And this chart shows you the main headline findings. We have, just as a benchmark, the transparent trade measures in black. What we see is subsidies to local firms growing as a trade distortion. We have, by the time we get to the early 20s, over 30, nearly 40% of world trade covered by subsidies to local firms. Subsidies to exporters and export incentives are an even larger problem. And then if you combine them, you can get the overall figure. Bear in mind that there will be some product overlap between the two subsidy categories. Let me say a couple of observations here before moving on. First, notice then that the key 2009 policy response to the global financial crisis was not to raise tariffs like the 1930s, but to actually offer subsidies. And in these cases, these are only subsidies to manufacturing firms or firms which produce goods. All the banking finance subsidies are not included in any of this. None of the Kurzarbeit subsidies for labor are included. This is all selective subsidization of firms. So the unilateral trade distortion that was most prevalent in the global financial crisis was on the subsidy side. Second observation to make here is that you may have heard Donald Trump complaining about how subsidies were distorting more and more of global trade, and he picked on US trading partners who he thought were doing this. And the answer is, yes, there was evidence of this. But we often as a profession chose to ignore it because anything that Donald Trump said couldn't possibly be right. Okay. Third comment to make is that these two types of subsidies work in different ways. the subsidies to local firms may well have substituted for some imports and reduced trade, but the subsidies, the export incentives should have increased trade. Now think about the presentation that Richard Baldwin gave earlier, where he showed the goods trade has faltered in its growth or at least compared to world GDP in recent years. I think the interesting question I would ask is, how much slower would a world goods trade have been in the absence of these export incentives? Another comment I would make is that Richard identified the growing export shares of the I6 countries. It is the very I6 countries that have offered these export incentives. So that might help you put the story together. And to our macro colleagues, much is often written about how globalization, China's integration in the world economy helped pull down prices over the last decades or so. One question you might want to ask since the global financial crisis is how much of the subsidies which have been pumped into the trading system have helped pull down prices too. So that might be a factor, and it's often a factor. I have not seen anyone connect the subsidy policy intervention data to the price changes at the aggregate level. So there may be some interesting ties to other presentations and observations which have been made earlier today.
Simon, with apologies, can I suggest 2 more minutes to conclude?
I will be done in 2 minutes.
Thank you.
Don't worry. You will probably be wanting to know how do countries vary across the G20? Well, this is if you took yesterday's policies which are in effect, these are the shares of national imports which are covered by different countries' trade distortions. So these are both the transparent import restrictions as well as the subsidies. We have some countries which are very have a lot of market access at risk. India, Indonesia, this will not surprise anyone. It may surprise you that if you add all this stuff up, China and the United States are barely indistinguishable in terms of their policy stance towards imports. And before one credits Japan, Mexico, and South Korea, all 3 countries are very good at hiding subsidies. So that's still there's still a work in progress there. So there's interesting variation across countries as well. Last point, I will not dwell on it much. Although we've talked a lot about trade in goods, some people earlier talked about trade in services and digital trade. We track in the digital policy alert the interventions which are affecting the digital sector, many of which are subject to cross-border competition. There has been a huge surge in unilateral action there, and a lot of that action is still in the pipeline. So that's, if you want to add to the unilateral picture, that's an important factor. Let me just look forward and draw out some questions which I think follow from this. We are seeing states being more active for all sorts of reasons, like dealing with climate change, narrowing the digital divide, et cetera, et cetera. I think a fundamental question is, does a more active state have to have a more discriminatory trade policy? What restraints are feasible on state action as governments act in a more activist way, dealing with all of these different challenges? And if that weren't enough, one layers on top of it the geopolitical rivalry, which has already been mentioned by others, and one can see just how much the pressure on unilateral trade policy will, I think, intensify. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Simon. Let me now invite Professor Beatrice Weder de Mauro from Geneva Graduate Institute, President of Center for Economic Policy Research. Beatrice, if you don't mind giving perhaps an abbreviated version of your presentation, that would be great. Please.
It will be an abbreviated version, Shanxing. I'm sorry for coming in late, and I'm sure that Maury and Linda have actually answered all the questions. I had still a question mark behind the financial globalization theme, and let me just give you a few thoughts on that and a few pictures also. So when we're talking about financial globalization, the picture has always been a little bit different from the globalization in goods, in the sense that we are absolutely aware of all the benefits that capital flows, open capital flows can get throughout the world. I'm not going to go into them. Here are a few on the slide: diversification, allocation, but also some income functions which make them attractive for financial centers. But there are also costs of financial integration. And These have been very prominently discussed in the whole international finance literature recently, and have also led to policy changes. I'm mentioning here too, vulnerability to sudden stops, and especially for countries with original sin on their balance sheet, and also the fact that you are possibly more exposed to a global financial cycle. So the global financial cycle, and I'm showing here the picture from the original study of Hélène, which is already a while ago, but the fact that there is a very high integration across many asset classes with global measures of risks, and therefore then the implications that may have for countries that are importing this risk, the spillovers across the world. That is one of the question marks that have been asked around financial integration. But there are also others, and I went out actually to look for evidence, scattered evidence of what might be fragmenting. So that is the analytical approach in this presentation. Another thing that we have been seeing fragmenting, though, and partly this is a response to a financial integration and a international monetary system, which was very unipolar. This is the global financial safety net, which has developed a number of regional organizations that want to substitute or at least complement the IMF, and are, however, fragmented between themselves. And another evidence of what has been happening at the global level in terms of the financial safety net is the stepping up of very few actually, central banks in the form of bilateral swap lines, and taking over to a certain extent the large crisis responses. Now, another way of looking at how is the globalization doing in terms of finance is just simply to look at asset growth. And this is the Lane, Milesi, Ferretti updated, last update that I could find, data set on global external financial assets. And what is remarkable here is that essentially it has stopped growing. Growth has halted after the global financial crisis. And that's mostly a consequence of diminished cross-border activity of global banks, but also of the fact that emerging markets are less financially integrated with the world, and their share of GDP has been increasing. So this picture here shows that maybe not fragmentation, but at least a not further increase in global financial integration has already been in the cards. Here, for more recent indicators of financial integration, I looked at the euro area, because here, as you know, the euro area is very, very concerned about financial integration and fragmentation. So they have been measuring this and looking at this carefully. These are two measures, price and quantity related measures of euro area financial fragmentation or integration across different shocks. And the main point here is that you see the sensitivity of the integration to crises and to confidence shocks. And this, at a higher frequency level, you see this also very clearly during the Ukraine crisis. So I'm now fast approaching the frontier where we are now, and where it is actually the most important question we are facing, namely, are we further fractioning across the globe because of geopolitical tensions, and what kind of, at least, what kind of evidence may we have? Where would this be manifesting? Again, at the very, very, there is no way of really answering this question. Definitely, in my view, but we can gather a few, at least danger signs. And here are some that I put together. On the one hand side, the fact that capital controls and their use has become much, much more frequent and also sanctioned may be leading to more protectionism also on the financial side. So for instance, if I look here, this is also applies to the point 5, protection against foreign FDI has become quite was rare in Europe, for instance, but is now quite standard that there are laws to make sure that technology and other seen assets are not getting into foreign hands. There is the extraterritorial application of law that has been a specialty of the US across the globe, but is also now being practiced by a few other countries. And that is, in my view, also a possible driver of fragmentation. Increasing mistrust between East and West. And then, of course, the major one, the biggest weaponization of finance through sanctions. Have the sanctions, due to the fact that that the West has used sanctions on Russia, which are of financial and affecting the payment system, going to change something for good, or is it just an episode? I have collected a few anecdotal evidences that are close here of things that might be breaking up or that might be danger signs. Let's start from the common framework on debt restructuring. There is a clear need for creditors to work together, have a global approach to some form of debt restructuring regime for highly indebted countries. The common framework is supposed to be this. Is it working? Question mark. There are lots of doubts around it. There is the question, what is China looking at when it's looking at the SWIFT and other sanctions against Russia, and what is China thinking? I already mentioned investment protection acts in the US and EU. And in fact, the chart on the right-hand side shows that extraterritorial sanctions have been increasing, and they have actually been, the correlation with the opening up in terms of trade and finance has been very, very marked. At the same time, sanctions have been more and more used. And again, finance has become one of the weapons. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. To reflect on not just the policy discussion, perhaps the entire program, I'm going to invite Professor Michael Spence of New York University and Nobel laureate in economics. Mike, please.
Well, thank you so much. So let me start by giving you two reactions to this. One is it's just been extraordinarily illuminating, covering an enormous amount of territory. And the second observation is this is an incredibly complex environment. And so it's not easy to pick all these things up. And I've just learned a tremendous amount. There's no way to try to sort of cover all this. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of pieces, but I should say before sort of launching in, and I won't be, particularly long-winded, is that I think we've talked about incredibly important dimensions of sort of economic and financial interdependence. And I think we're on a journey that, we're trying to make as productive as possible, at least the people who are participating in this are, and people who have important policy making positions are certainly trying to do that, but it's not easy. So on things that struck me as really important that kind of related to what many speakers said, I think this capacity of the digital technology, in particular the platforms, to expand the accessible market is incredibly important tool. I mean, we have powerful tools, in multiple areas: biomedical science, solar, climate change and so on. And this is an example of that. And apropos the goods and services, Chen Long mentioned that the accessible market, expands from local using a platform like Taobao to about 1,000 kilometers in services. The expansion's nearly infinite. And so if you can find a way to regulate that sector properly, in a world in which, other dimensions of digital technology will have to change the basis of comparative advantage, especially for early stage developing countries, the cross-border expansion of this rapidly growing services area in a way that it makes it accessible to a very wide range of countries across the kind of income spectrum just strikes me as kind of first order importance. The second observation relates to what Linda talked about, and I'd like to just reinforce it. We live in a world which has increasingly frequent and severe shocks. Most people think climate. Some people think of the Ukraine war. Some people think of sanctions. All of these things have been talked about, and the pandemic and so on. And I'm sure we haven't seen the end of this. And one observation is, I remember 6 months ago saying, I believe that on the climate side of this, that this is going to start showing up in a serious way in macroeconomic data. Now, 6 months later, I think it's just plain obvious that the climate shocks, are at a level that they're a significant headwind. But the point Linda mentioned, which I wanted to emphasize, is that if you have a lot of shocks with high beta, low beta, idiosyncratic, some degree of correlation, you really have to ask yourself, are the risk-sharing mechanisms that we have sufficient to deal with this? And by risk-sharing mechanisms, I mean a combination of private insurance, sort of domestic, sort of social insurance and social policies that are the responses to these shocks, and the international dimension. And when I've thought about that and talked with friends in the UN, I can't help the conclusion that what we have now is just totally inadequate. You don't have to look very far. You can't get insurance for most of the significant shocks, in at least private insurance. I don't think the international protection dimensions, say for that band of high impact climate change in the sort of equatorial area, are particularly well built. Adaptation commitments are, in terms of payoffs, are just way, way below the commitments that have been made. And there's a question about whether the commitments are even adequate. So I think, if we're going to live in this world, and I think we are, that's just the way it is, then I think, more attention to these risk mitigation mechanisms is really important. The third observation is that, I'm going to overstate this, but I think I'm repeating something Richard said. I don't believe that manufacturing, some of which isn't very labor intensive now, but now I mean all manufacturing, and most of logistics will not be labor intensive sometime 10 or 15 years from now. It just seems pretty clear. Now, most people think automation when they think that. There's an element of automation, but with the long run process here is people are working with a new set of machines. And so a version of it is augmentation. It's not as scary as it sounds, but I think it's important there's lots of examples of this that, so I won't repeat them, but the one that struck me is the Japanese are testing autonomous ships and ferries with literally nobody on them. It was reported recently. The reason I think that's important is that probably that does mean that we'll have some degree of localization of these kinds of activities. If they're not labor intensive, and if the world we lived in for most of the post-war period was driven by essentially the search for very valuable, relatively immobile inputs, namely labor, that seems to be an important thing. And I think it reinforces the message that we want to get our arms around, the fact that trade will probably continue to tip probably dramatically, not away from goods entirely, but in the direction of services. So that's one point. Just a couple more. I thought the discussion of the WTO's orientation was particularly interesting and important. So I want to try to say a few words about that. I think the point that Anabel made that, even if, and I think it is true, that economic policy is tipping away from what you might call economic efficiency and more in the direction of that, plus a whole bunch of things that sound like security, not just national security, but economic security, energy security, etc. That is not an excuse to throw trade out at all. And so I think we've over-dramatized this a little bit. But there is an important, and the point that Anabel made, that trade is not only a vulnerability, especially if they're choke points, but an important element of resilience because of the opposite of choke points, but spreading things out. And I think that's a point that should not be lost. That said, we are going to live in a world in which policymakers are going, for whatever reasons, at the national level, are going to be driven by these questions of resilience, and for all kinds of reasons, including what Beatrice just mentioned. The expanded use of sanctions, lack of trust between the United States and China, concentration of semiconductors, the most advanced ones in the world, in Taiwan, and so on. I think we're just going to have to face the fact that a chunk of the resources in multiple countries, especially the big ones, are going to be devoted to reducing the vulnerabilities, and that's not necessarily going to give us globally efficient outcomes. But I think it's inevitable, and so we have to sort of accept that. And it's the latest of 3 bills that invest in these things that I know Anne has reservations about the CHIPS and Science Act in terms of government's participation in that sector, but we can have that sort of discussion offline. I'm referring to her latest Project Syndicate piece of her said, let's not take the private sector out of something it does well. But you have these kinds of investments are going to appear in Europe and China, and I'm sure in India, as well as and they're not necessarily bad. They will advance the frontier, one hopes, and produce a kind of, at least in this dimension, a reasonably benign form of strategic competition. But they are, I think, going to be a permanent feature, or a nearly permanent feature of the landscape. And we have to build the cooperative things that Maury talked about, sort of around the realities that, we just, and Anne's right, it would be nice if the United States and China sat down and said, we'll disagree on this, these are neutral and these we'll cooperate on. But in the meantime, even if they do sit down and do that, we don't trust each other enough to create a kind of dependency in the way the global economy is constructed. So I think that's right. Several years ago, I asked myself the question. It was around the time of the Great Financial Crisis. What are these choke points? What is it that takes down a whole economy? And there are a few sectors that are critical. Telecommunications and now digital is one of them. Transportation is one. Energy is certainly one. And the financial sector, you can destroy an economy with the financial sector. So I sort of start out from that point and reach the conclusion that a certain amount of overriding of market-driven forces, overriding using policy is going to be important in these areas, as it will be in things that relate to national security, even if they're too broadly defined. And that's just another way of saying, you know, we're going to have to live in that world. The final thing I'll say, when I look out at the global economy right now, I see these are all things that have been mentioned. One, rising sovereign debt levels. Once in the great financial crisis, then a drift up, and then another big increment in the pandemic. Aging, rapid aging, and rising dependency ratios. In 75% of the world's GDP by country. A still puzzling productivity slowdown or stalemate, right? And, you know, an assault on inflation, which will surely raise real interest rates, at least for a while, and produce not only debt distress, but, you know, and then I ask myself, how well are we going to do on the digital transformation, the energy transition, and other critically important things? I mean, take the energy transition. The estimates are we need 3 trillion incrementally a year in order to accomplish this. Let's say it's 60% private, 40% public. This has all been mentioned here. You know, I really wonder, you know, when you put all those things together, how we're going to get this done. I think we need to sit down and look at, you know, the bits and pieces, but we also have to look at the big picture and ask ourselves, you know, can we really sort of solve problems of this magnitude? One of the conclusions, and I'll stop at this, that I've drawn, you know, is we are living in a supply constrained world for a while now. We lived in a demand constrained world for a long period of time. And the supply side, you know, with sort of almost infinite amounts of underutilized productive capacity in the emerging economies, we've reached the end of that, right? We're not going to have an almost unlimited supply of these things. Bottom line is we're living in a very different world, and so I think the kinds of things that we're talking about today, which are an attempt to adapt to it, are not only fascinating but important. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for these remarks. Now let's have open discussion. We have many more talents than our illustrious speakers on the program. We have additional Nobel laureates in economics. We have chief economists of at least 2 international organizations here. We have many more former policymakers, influential researchers and producers of ideas. So I want to suggest for those of you who are able to stay, we're going to extend the program by 5 more minutes. For those of you who are able to stay, and those who are on the program, you can unmute and perhaps make a brief comment or react to each other's comment if you wish. And others who wish to speak, it'd be useful if you could send me a private message to help me to manage the time better. So let's open up. Let me start with anyone on the program who wish to speak. Richard, please.
I just have a question, actually. If you look at the trade, you look at the finance, you often see 2008 as a bit of a turning point. But why? I'm curious. What happened in 2008 that made all these
generally
changes?
Recession leads to a contraction of trade relative to GDP?
That's when it started going down, and the same thing for finance. So it seemed to be an enormous shock to something. But I honestly don't have a pat answer. I was just wondering if somebody else has one.
It could be, I'm just speculating, it could be that because of the Wall Street crisis, people lost faith and confidence in the American-led system, to be honest, okay? So that's why, to a certain extent, people are questioning the globalization. And the last 40, 50 years, China has been following, so has been the emerging markets following the Western-led, so-called like policy recommendations. And that hasn't really worked out too well for many emerging markets. So that's just my 2 pence.
This is Professor Shenling Ben, a former finance industry practitioner, now a professor in university. Okay. Anyone else?
Just a comment on Richard's thing. one of the lessons from the great financial crisis in the emerging economies that we learned, by just talking to people and when we did the Growth Commission work was, that was such a severe shock that the multinational financial institutions were essentially called home by their regulators, right? Because of capital adequacy problems. And so supports what Ben just said. And so one of the lessons the emerging economies took away from it is, regardless of who owns the assets, you better have a domestic financial sector that, is responsive to domestic regulators, the central bank, and domestic concerns, or you'll be in serious trouble. And I think, most of them were in that condition. They didn't own the toxic assets, but they're absolutely sure. And I agree with your point about trusting the kind of whatever the so-called Anglo-Saxon approach was.
Professor Casanova?
Thank you. My question is for, sorry, I don't remember the name, Beatrice. So will the launch of the central bank digital currencies, as it is the case in China and of course Nigeria and Bahamas, will this launch further divide the financial sector? You mentioned that there are already experiments of cross financial exchanges with Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, bypassing SWIFT. So do you feel that this will further divide the financial sector?
Thank you for the question. I do think that all the rise of digital platforms, but also in particular of the central bank digital currencies that are explicitly geared towards also crossing borders and being used by non-residents, as the digital yuan is being designed, is a possible avenue for, on the one hand side, regional, at least integration, but I do think it might also be an avenue for further fragmentation at the global level.
Okay. I have an example to complement what Richard and Krueger said earlier about, in addition to the rise of an intermediate service, I want to note that there are also examples of things that used to be counted as good trade, now counted as service trade. For example, movies and music used to be exported as goods, the RIMs and CDs. Now they are digital files, right? So there's sort of another aspect of rising service as well. Anyone else? If not, I will turn to Long Chen as president of the Luohan Academy. So before I thank everyone for wonderful presentations, I give Long Chen a chance to say something to us.
Well, no, actually I have nothing to add. I think it's the scope is really it's huge to handle, to absorb. So I think we learn a lot. Otherwise, I really appreciate everybody's contribution, but not much to add. Thanks, Shanjing.
Great. I think at least I come away with more awareness of risks, various kinds of risk, threats to globalization, but at the same time, also optimistic about the continuation of globalization and certainly the continued prospect that the benefits that globalization can generate for us and for all countries. So let me thank all the participants and the speakers again for sharing your wonderful insight with us. So thank you. Let's conclude the event here.